I found a mermaid in the swamp, and it ruined my life. Written by Ethan Hallstrom. You know, I never thought that I'd have a chance to fall in love. Not in love, anyway. Not the kind that people write sonnets about. Not the kind that dominates movies and books and the top 40. Not because I don't want it, or because I'm not capable of feeling it, but because I'm not exactly the type of person that people fall in love with. And that's kind of half of the whole deal, right? Don't get me wrong, people like me. I had plenty of friends when I was young, girls and guys. I'm nice, I'm easygoing, I'm low maintenance. I never got in anybody's way, so nobody felt the need to harass me. But I've never been the type of person that anybody would love romantically. The type of person that someone could feel an active attraction to. Sure, some people might think that I'm sweet or helpful or a good friend, but I promise you that nobody's fantasizing about my dumpy ass. I'm gross, is what I'm saying. Greasy, lumpy, asymmetrical, a real stage 5 uggo. I wasn't born with any specific deformity, at least not that I'm aware of. Unless chronic goblin face disorder exists. My head is huge and knobby and blunt in all the wrong places. My eyes are small and beady and prone to bags. I have wide, clammy lips and crooked teeth and a pretty non-existent chin. And that's just about the stuff above my shoulders. I could go on and on about the little haunch in my spine or my spindly arms or my waxy skin. But I think that I've painted enough of a picture. You get the point. I'm ugly, and not in a way that 3 days a week at Planet Fitness could fix. It was hard at first. My teenage years were the worst of them. The feeling of exclusion was sharper back then, more persistent. The people around me were blossoming, discovering what it felt like to want and be wanted, and I was relegated to the sidelines. Forced to either watch and envy or slap my gross hands over my gross ears and shut it all out. It got easier though, just like everyone promised that it would. I got good at being on my own. I know that that sounds depressing, but I swear it's not actually as sad as it sounds. I made it work. I'm actually a little proud of it. My independence. A few years back, I moved into a secluded little cottage on the outskirts of Baton Rouge, just far enough away from the lights and roads to make sure that nothing disturbed the solitude that I had gotten so dependent on. I've worked odd jobs for a while, mostly night shift stuff, which means that I never have to interact with anyone that I don't want to. I spend most of my days fishing in this gorgeous patch of the bayou outside of my property. I've found a lot of happiness perched at the edge of a stout little dock with a cooler of Coke and a bag of sunflower seeds. And for a while, this entire routine was fine. It worked. I spent so long alone that my need to socialize dried up. It calcified and withered into something vestigial and forgotten. And then I was happy alone. At least, that's what I told myself. Really, my happiness was just an illusion, a contrivance, a convenient narrative. I was lying to myself, and I didn't know it until the night that I met her. I screamed the first time she appeared. I couldn't help it, she startled me. When I drew back to cast my line for the 100th time that night, and I caught that fateful first glimpse of a pale face beaming at me from under the water, I screamed. I dropped my rod in the bayou and fell backwards out of my chair in surprise. I think my first thought was that I'd seen some woman's cadaver, a body that some wandering murderer had chucked into the swamp. I scrambled to my feet, and after a few seconds of deep breathing, my curiosity outweighed my fear, and I returned to the dock's edge to check again. She was still there, waiting for me, peering up from her side of the water's surface. It's stupid, but I remember literally gasping at the sight of her. She was almost unbelievably beautiful. Her big, curious eyes with dark eyelashes, her wry, knowing smile, the halo of black hair that framed her delicate head in the water, floating in a wreath of gently swaying tendrils. She was floating on her back, maybe a few inches below the surface. I remember how she tucked her hands across her chest, sort of like an otter. For a while, I stared, transfixed, my whole body rigid with surprise and incomprehension, and something else I can't place, something like a sort of reverence. She was so ethereal and radiant, and so clearly unnatural. I didn't know whether to start crying or start running. We shared wordless, electric eye contact for what could have been seconds or hours. Then she blew a bubble at me, waved, and swam away. The spell was broken. You want to know something funny? She was the first person to really look at me, to make real, intentional, direct eye contact with me in maybe half a decade. The initial feeling of being visible, was intoxicating. But the instant that it ended, I was changed. I couldn't be alone anymore. A wave of need, the fruit of years of self-imposed isolation, flooded me. It crashed into me like a tsunami and receded, leaving behind an all-consuming craving in its wake. I needed to see her again. I came back every night, and she appeared every night, sooner or later. She was a playful, sprightly thing. A fast swimmer with a penchant for well-aimed splashes and raw fish. She let me talk to her, and she would listen, appearing almost rapt by even my most mundane little comments and stories. I would talk, my voice crackly and weak from years of neglect, and she would hang on to every word. She never spoke. I'm not sure she even knew how to speak, but she sang. It wasn't a noise, not a physical one. She didn't even need to open her mouth. The music emanated from her being whenever she willed it, clear and silver. It was like a chorus of bells chiming in perfect clarity. She sang to me every night, and I would walk home at dawn with her alien melodies playing in my head. It became a routine. I brought her food and played her music, and I told her stories. She danced and ate and laughed her soundless underwater laugh. Those nights were the best of my life. Now, I'm not stupid. I knew this was too good to be true, almost from the start. There was a reason that, in all my visits, I never got in the water with her. She'd make her coy little come-hither gestures and bat her eyes in invitation, and I would always politely decline, because I knew what she was. Or, at least, I had a pretty good idea. Plenty of cultures have their own stories about gorgeous women drawing lonely men to the depths, and they always end the same. Tales of mermaids, naiads, ninjo, and Iara. Every corner of the world had its own version of the same story, each with the same moral. Don't believe the women in the water. And every once in a while, whatever illusion she was hiding behind whatever magical disguise she employed, it would slip. Sometimes when the water rippled wrong or the moon dipped behind a cloud, I would get a glimpse of a different version of her. Her gaping mouth and the dozens of obsidian chunk teeth that lined it. The jagged gills like black axe wounds in her muscular neck. The dead, doll-like eyes set into her head, suddenly devoid of the life and warmth that normally danced just behind her retinas. And besides, even if I hadn't caught those little glimpses, I would have known. No beautiful thing would ever pick me. Not without an ulterior motive. I'm a worm, I'm a louse, I'm a low thing. I'm built for dirt and shade and isolation, not light and warmth and love. And because I've known that my whole life, I saw almost from the start that she was lying, that she was trying her best to trick me. And yet I loved her more for it. Knowing how hideous her true form was should have terrified me, should have set me running for the safety of land, should have kept me from ever returning to that lonely dock. But instead it comforted me. It made her relatable, even if she was a predator. So I keep coming back, and she keeps making her flirtatious little offer. And if I'm being honest, it's a tempting one. I know what she wants. I know what's going to happen to me the instant I lower myself into the swamp. I know exactly what her touch is going to feel like. And it's not going to be a gentle caress that I've spent every night of the last month fantasizing about. But my other option is to leave her, to ignore her forever, to go back to my hermit's existence in that drafty cottage with my bi-monthly paycheck and fish breakfast and empty bed. And somehow, that sounds more painful than a double row of fish teeth stuck into my neck. I have a choice to make tonight. Should I live safe and quiet and alone? Or should I die and finally know what it is to be embraced, to be truly wanted by something so much more beautiful than I deserve? I can hear her singing now in my head, and I know what I'm going to choose. The Pine Barrens, written by TBL Honor. Stay out of the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. My name is Sinclair Roseborough, and I hope you heed my warning. My story starts on a beautiful fall day. I had decided that I was going to go out into the Barrens and camp for the weekend. The weather was supposed to be amazing, 70-degree highs, 55-degree lows. I went down to my outdoor store and I picked up a few pieces of my kit that needed replacing. I got a new camp stove, a machete, and water filtration tablets. I also picked up a couple of pounds worth of homemade venison jerky that one of the local hunters had made. Once I returned home, I prepared everything that I would need for the trip before taking a liberal dose of whiskey and falling asleep. I awoke the next morning at the late hour of 4 a.m. After a breakfast of coffee and bacon with eggs, I began packing my truck with all of my gear, excited to set out on my journey. Once I had everything packed, I locked up my house and I started my truck. On my way out of town, I stopped by the local grocery store, which was family-run and open 24 hours. I picked up another cup of hot coffee and some salt and pepper for my meals while I was staying in the Barrens. I said my goodbyes to the cashier and I left with a huge smile on my face, excited for the weekend. I jumped on the Garden State Parkway and I began my drive to my camping spot. I reached my camping spot around 7 a.m. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, and it cast a warm gleam upon the barrens and the waters of the Oswego River. I unpacked all of my gear and I set up my tent, eager to enjoy a day of fishing, small game hunting, and solitude. After setting up my tent, I also set my camp stove up and began gathering firewood and tinder. Once my camp was set up to my satisfaction, I grabbed my fishing pole and I went down to the river. I eagerly set up my chair and baited my line. I cast my line into the waters and I laid back with my whiskey, sipping it slowly and enjoying the warmth it sent into my stomach. I was fishing for about an hour or so when I heard a strange sound. A harsh bellow echoed through the woods around my fishing spot. It was low and gravelly, while at the same time it emitted a high-pitched whine. It was not an animal call that I was familiar with, but I wasn't concerned. I've spent an ample amount of time in the outdoors and I know how to defend myself from animal attacks. I shrugged the sound off as I got a bite on my line. After a short struggle, I pulled a decent-sized herring out of the water. I placed it in my cooler and I threw my line back out, breathing a sigh of pure relaxation as I did so. This weekend was going to be amazing. I wrapped up my fishing session and I returned to my camp several hours later. I began cleaning my catches and seasoning them with the salt and pepper that I had bought at the store earlier. I had finished my flask of whiskey on the riverbank, so I was feeling understandably giddy and warm. While I was bent over my catches, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look only to see the bushes swaying gently. I looked behind the bushes, but I didn't find anything unusual, and I couldn't find any tracks under the heavy leaf cover on the ground. Shrugging it off, I went back and I started to cook my catches on my camp stove. The smell of fish permeated the air, making my mouth water. I finished cooking my meal and I sat down by the fire that I had started to eat. I finished my meal and I took out a wood carving I had been working on. It had begun as a piece of firewood, but I had already shaved most of the bark off of it and was beginning to whittle it down. I was still unsure of what I was going to make it into. As I set to my work, I heard the strange animal call a second time. It was further away, but still no less eerie. I made note to set up traps around my camp tonight, just in case the animal was predatory. I didn't want to be caught unaware while I was sleeping. I went back to my work and began whittling down the piece of wood. I took a sip of cold beer that I had pulled from my cooler. I didn't want to get too inebriated before I finished carving. By the time I finished my carving, I had whittled the wood down to a square about 10 inches long and 5 inches wide. It was also about 5 inches thick with a thick bark covering the base. I had decided that I was going to carve it into a leaping fish. As the light began to fade, I tied the string to the trees around my camp and I pulled it through some old cans that I kept for just this purpose. I'm a light sleeper, so the sound of the cans jangling together would wake me if an animal came into my camp. After I finished up, I imbibed more of my whiskey and banked my fire, eager to go to sleep and do some small game hunting the next day. I had no idea what a terrifying night I was in for. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night to my makeshift can alarm system jangling. There wasn't a hint of wind blowing against my tent, so I knew something was trying to enter, or had already entered my camp. I lay there in silence and I listened for the sound of whatever animal it was. I began to hear heavy footsteps and loud snuffling about 30 feet away from my tent. I cautiously unzipped my tent zipper and I peered out, looking for the source of the sound. The moon was full tonight, so there was plenty of light to see by. I noticed a dark shape rummaging along the ground. It was huge, about 5 feet at the shoulder and covered in black fur. A bear had come into my camp. This was not good. I hadn't replaced my bear spray before coming on my trip, and I cursed myself for it. I knew that I had to make a lot of noise and make myself as large as possible to scare the bear off. I hastily opened up my tent and I retrieved my pots from my camping gear. The bear turned towards me as it heard the noise and snorted in my direction. I stood up from my crouched position with a shouted, "Ha!" I stood up as tall as I could and I began to bang the pots together, shouting at the bear to get out, get! The bear stood up on its hind legs and growled a challenge. I stood my ground and kept banging the pots together, shouting at the bear and hoping that it would move off. The bear lowered itself to the ground and began to back away, keeping its gaze on me while continuing to growl. I took a few steps forward, emboldened by the bear's retreat. After a few more bangs of my pots, the bear turned around and fled into the woods. I let out a sigh of relief, knowing how awful the encounter could have turned out. It was only then that I heard the sounds of twigs snapping behind me. I whipped my head towards the sound, thinking I had scared off a mama bear with her cub. I wish that I was right and that was the case, but I was wrong. In the woods, towering about 3 feet above my tent, were a pair of red eyes. The eyes were set inside the face of what appeared to be a goat or maybe an antelope. Curving away from the brow of the creature were 2 thick horns, blackened with either age or decay. Numerous sharp teeth extended down from the maw of the creature. The head was set on a comically small body that was covered in dark fur, and it had 2 shortened arms. The arms were tipped with clawed hands that hung limply as if they did not function. Supporting the monstrosity were 2 legs that appeared to be those of an ostrich, except it had hoofs instead of feet. As it opened its mouth and bellowed, I recognized the animal call that I had heard earlier in the day. The thing's mouth was filled with sharp teeth, the teeth of a predator. The monstrosity stank to high heaven, smelling of rotten flesh and mold. My vision began to fade as it screamed at me again. The fear was too much for my mind to handle. The monster began rushing towards me, and I decided that it would be a good time to hightail it out of there. I sprinted for my truck and then fumbled with my keys. As I pulled them out of my pocket, I dropped them into the leaves. I stopped and scrambled to find them as the creature bore down on me. Cursing and praying, I finally found my keys as the monster slammed into me, knocking me over. It screeched and brought its foot down, hoping to crush my skull so that it could feast. I barely managed to move my head in time. I kicked the thing as hard as I could in its leg and made it tumble over to its side. I jumped up and sprinted for my truck. I could feel the thing's anger at missing its prey. I managed to reach my truck and I got the engine started. Just then, the creature crashed into the driver's door, and it began biting at the roof. It caused an unholy screech to rise from the paint as its teeth skittered across the roof. I put the gas pedal to the floor and I got out of there, kicking up dirt and rock in the creature's face. The thing shrieked and actually began to chase my truck, and to my horror, I could see that it was keeping pace. I couldn't get good traction on the leaves and mud of the forest floor, so my truck was only going about 35 miles per hour. The chase continued all the way to the road, with me sweating bullets the entire time, thinking that the creature was going to catch me. As my tires hit the pavement, I looked in the rearview mirror to see those hateful red eyes staring at me from the edge of the forest. I floored it and got away from there as fast as I could. When I finally got home, I didn't tell my story to anyone. Who would believe me? All they would say is that I drank too much and was seeing things that weren't there. But I know what I saw. I had a bruise from where it struck me, and the paint on my truck's roof was scratched all up. And so I'm now telling you this in hopes of getting my story out there. Please stay out of the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. You'll thank me later. The Whistlers, written by Blackwings16. The outdoors isn't something I would consider myself acquainted with. The potent air from the moist soil, the non-stop chirps of life in every nook and cranny, and the ambiguous emptiness that I feel when I'm among the trees are things that do not suit my daily life, nor my personality. Exchange the moist soil, the chirping life, and the emptiness for the smell of carbon exhaust from a passing bus, the sounds of commuters whistling through their morning walk, and the clear, overcrowded sight of a city street, and there you have my paradise. Growing up in a city injects thrill into every aspect of daily life. Danger, adventure, and plain adrenaline can lurk around the corner of every city block. The natural world simply cannot produce the same aspect of thrill in life. Not enough happens. Not enough lurks in the corners of the thickets. That being said, I try to stay away from nature as much as possible, remaining in the shadows of skyscrapers rather than the shadow of the oak. However, being 17 and living with my recently retired, high-ranked naval father, who has more than enough experience and memories with the woods, well, my paradise couldn't be present at all times. This realization dawned on me when my father approached me to tell me that we were going to spend a week in a cabin in the North Woods. Son of a mother, my emotionally accurate thought was interrupted when my dad handed me an oversized suitcase to toss into the back of the car. "You might want to grab a pillow for the ride. We have a long way to go," he said, smirking. This must be punishment for how late I came home from Stephanie's house last week, I thought to myself. Little did my father know, my tardiness was due to the curious nature I was born with. I was simply walking around the dark streets exploring. Albeit that may have been a rather dangerous and unintelligent venture, but nevertheless it was filled with entertainment for myself. The punishment fits the not-so-crime-adjacent action, I guess. So, nonetheless, we piled into the car and set off north. The drive was seemingly endless. After about 7 hours, there was nothing but dense forest surrounding us. It wasn't long before the nice paved road turned into a gravel one, tossing and shaking the car in such a way that no fisherman would have been able to resist the motion sickness. Upon arrival, the sight of a very underkept, not-so-sturdy-looking log cabin lay before us. "The best home we could ask for out in these parts, huh, bud?" my father said in a slightly teasing tone. "Oh, you bet. I'm thinking it took a fortune to build her," I said, rolling my eyes in resentment. After quickly unpacking the car and moving into our temporary home, my dad suggested that we take a walk to the sea of the surrounding pine and oak. With nothing to do other than stare at some truly talentless art hanging from the walls of the cabin, I accepted his request willingly, but not happily. As we plummeted into the endless abyss of trees, comfort hastily left my being. Gone were the skyscrapers, the commuters whistling on their way to work, and the crowded, comforting city streets, only to be replaced with thick bark and, oddly, silence. There was no chirping, no singing of any life around us, and in addition, I never truly felt empty or alone amongst the trees. Yes, my father was beside me, but there seemed to be something else present in the air. I couldn't quite put words to it. I pushed that to the far reaches of my mind, As we continued, I began to hear strange sounds from all around us. They reminded me of the whistling commuters that I encountered every day. But something was off. "What was that?" I asked Dad. "Oh, that's just the wind in the trees, the leaves rustling and the wood creaking. Almost sounds alive, doesn't it?" he said. Yeah, sure," I said, trying to push back the paranoid feeling that was growing inside of me. Our walk was short, only about an hour. I tried not to think about the sinister feeling that I received from the trees, but every now and again it would tiptoe into my conscious mind. Later, I sat there lying beside a fire in the dusty family room when Dad approached me saying that he had to run into town to grab a few things. How long will you be?" I asked. "Oh, only about a few hours or so. Unfortunately, the nearest town is about 50 miles from here," he said, sighing. And with that, he drove off to God knows whatever town would be in this barren wasteland. So I sat there alone, watching the dancing flames of the family room fire for several minutes before boredom pulsed through every vein in my body. For some reason, my natural curiosity pushed its way into my mind and triggered my exploratory being. "Why not go for a little midnight stroll?" it asked. So, as I stepped out the stairs onto the rear patio, I noticed that the forest was filled with the sounds of crickets, frogs, and basically anything that dwells in the mud. This was a pleasant surprise, but the empty, lonely aura surrounding me was not. "You're going to be lonely no matter what until Dad gets back, so you might as well explore," said my curiosity. And with that thought, I set off for a little moonlight adventure. I never noticed how beautiful the natural world was, honestly. Everything was just so primal. The chirp of the crickets, the croaks of frogs, the light of fireflies briefly illuminating the area, and the wind in the trees. Wait, where was the whistling noise that accompanied the breeze earlier today? As if some higher power was out there playing a sick joke on me, the orchestra of nature ceased. There was nothing but silence. Even the wind came to a halt, causing the leaves of the trees to sit motionless, like they were bodies hanging from the gallows. The only thing that remained were the fireflies, still blessing their surroundings with short bursts of light from their posterior. With the retreat of the sounds from the natural world came the approach of something far more sinister. The approach of the being accompanied by things that I simply could not lay eyes on. As that feeling coursed through my body, the familiar sound of whistling once again filled my ears. I didn't know whether to act on my fight or flight instinct, so I merely stood still, waiting. The whistling grew louder and louder, coming from every direction. Just as it felt as if something was whistling directly into my ear, the fireflies shined on something. It was only for a second or two, but I could have sworn that it was a person. Relief filled my body as I felt more safe with another person being around me, but that ignorant feeling quickly faded. What in the world would another person be doing so far out here? And why would they be following me? That thought died as soon as the fireflies illuminated once more. It was not a person. Whatever was standing a few feet away from me in the shadows didn't look like something God would have created. It had the figure of a humanoid being, but its limbs were elongated and bent at unnatural angles. Atop its disfigured, human-like body was a round head that housed two sunken, pale eyes. and a gaping maw that was filled with needle-point teeth. However, that was only the way the one that stood directly before me appeared. There were others. I couldn't see them fully, but their awful silhouettes sickened me to the point where I desired no further physical details of their appearance. Still frozen in some sort of shock, the closest being crept closer and closer. As it grew inches away from my body, it let out a loud, familiar whistle through its open, grinning mouth. As if some electrical shock pulsed through my body, I suddenly threw myself into an all-out sprint towards the cabin, with the whistlers closely behind me. I hadn't realized how far I had walked out into the woods, but the approximately 15-minute sprint gave me an inclination. As the cabin lights filled my vision, I looked back to see my pursuers were about 50 feet behind, and there were too many of them to count. They ran in such unnatural ways that the mere sight of it made me nauseous. I practically broke down the back door of the cabin after bustling through. I managed to close and lock the door. Then I quickly did so with each and every other door and window throughout the cabin. Then I barricaded myself in the upstairs closet, waiting for Dad to get home and hopefully help me get out of this hell that he put me into. All I could do was sit still and try to keep quiet. I heard thumps and scratches come from the ceiling. Most likely those things were crawling around on the roof. The whistling never stopped. It was a constant reminder of the creature's presence. I sat in fear for what felt like an eternity until the whistlers erupted into what sounded like cackling, maybe laughter. Shortly after they began their unnatural chorus of laughter, silence once again tore through the air, leaving a stale, sinister sense in my ears. Maybe it's safe to come out. Maybe they got bored or just simply couldn't get into the house, I thought. As I was just about to open the closet door, a familiar sound echoed from the back of the closet. I wasn't in the city, so that whistling wasn't coming from a commuter. The Abandoned Cabin Along FS 472. Written by M40 Kid. One day, while walking along FS 472 on a fly fishing adventure, I came across an abandoned cabin. I must have driven past it over 100 times. But I could have never seen it through the dense overgrowth, and the road was finally closed about a year ago. The day that I found the cabin, nothing really exciting or eventful happened. But 2 weeks later, I went back on Labor Day with one of my best fly fishing pals. The day started out tame, walking up to the start of the CNR section by the river. We passed the cabin, and I thought that I saw something in a broken window, so we stopped and watched for a second. It turned out to be a crow that had a deformed beak, so we laughed it off and continued on our trip. On the way back out, we saw a chair that had been moved into the doorway, so we kind of guessed that someone had gotten curious. A few days later, we went back. This time, we're both carrying because it's getting close to bear season. While on the way up to the cabin, we see some weird stuff, including some occultic signs around the area. So we decided to check out the cabin. It was basically empty, all but a Ouija board and a pentagram that was carved into the floor. We were like, yeah, nothing too exotic here. So we went on up the mountain and continued our trip. And all we really thought was that it was really bland. Our trip was great other than the feeling that we were being watched. But wildlife tends to be pretty friendly, so we just shook it off. Now, the hike out is when things got really freaky. A few of the rocks on the path that we had hiked in on, and some that we had climbed over in the stream, well, they had relatively fresh, cultic, and satanic symbols drawn on them. And the rocks were completely dry where someone would have had to stand to draw on them. Now, the trail that we had come in on was rather crowded and claustrophobic in one place. But on the way out, it had cleared out. There had been something that looked like a tunnel made of laurel, but that was now completely gone. So we quickly round the bend where this was, and then we hop over the fire road gate, and we start heading down 472 back to the parking lot. It was here that we started seeing a lot of funny shadows, and then we started hearing funny noises. We both quickly got our handguns out of our packs. Anyway, as we get to the last bridge that we have to cross, we see a reddish-black figure. It's wearing a plague doctor mask and is surrounded by a reddish mist. It quickly vanished into the woods. Both of us were now in a panic. We started running. Now, at this point, it was about 3 miles to the truck. Our pace had to be something between jogging and sprinting. Anyway, as we rounded the curve by the cabin, we saw more figures wearing those masks. At this point, we still had about 2 miles left before we got to the parking lot. So we both picked up the pace, hoping that the figures were just us losing our minds. We kept moving for about 400 yards before we rounded the next corner in the trail. There were more figures in the road this time, so we got ready for whatever was going to happen. But we just both kept running, and we ran right through the figures like they weren't even there. Once we got about a mile further down the trail, we slowed our pace to a slow jog. We were starting to pass the upper reaches of the 2 campgrounds. We looked down into it, and there were the figures again. Some were standing in the river. Others were outside tents. Now, at this point, we have about 15 to 20 minutes before the sun is completely down. But we only had a quarter mile left to get to the truck, so we ran. Once we got back to the truck, we quickly threw all of our gear into the truck bed and then drove down the gravel road until we got past the golf course and slowed back down. We didn't talk about any of this until the next day when we met up at our local fly shop on a lunch break to discuss what we had seen with a couple of our friends. From our digging that day and over the next couple of days at the local library and from talking to older people around the area, we found out that back in the 50s and 60s, the cabin was home to a cult. This cult, for some reason, was centered around nuclear Armageddon. Anyway, all 15 of the members committed mass suicide on October 23rd, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The photos that we found showed the cult members in reddish-black robes, wearing plague doctor masks. When we discovered this, we were creeped out to say the least. A day or two passed, and things around my house and workplace started to get weird and creepy. Things would move when they shouldn't. There would be whispers that would come from the darkness. And the most disturbing of all was the iron smell of blood that hovered in the air on foggy mornings. There was also an unusual number of crows around me any time that I went outside. This included the crow with the deformed beak that I had seen when we first found the cabin. Now increasingly freaked out, I researched what the crow could mean. I found out that we had been marked, and that the only way to end the cult's haunting of my friend and I was to capture the crow and sacrifice it in the pentagram. I texted this to my buddy and I asked him if he had seen a crow with a deformed beak over the last couple of days. He replied that yes, every time he looked outside. I quickly replied that we needed to catch him and sacrifice him in the pentagram. He replied, all right. But he wondered how we were going to catch the bird. It would just fly away. I replied, trust me, I know just how. And I told him that he should meet me at the park in 15 minutes. Once we met at the park, he quickly asked what my plan was to catch the bird. I replied that I would show him, and I pulled out a towel. And I slowly walked up to the crow while it was just sitting on the ground. I quickly threw the towel over it and wrapped it up in the towel. I turned to look back at my friend to see him in pure shock, pointing back behind me. I quickly looked behind me to see all 15 of the figures. They were standing just a few feet away from me. I quickly stood up and bolted over to the truck and got in with my friend. We looked back before leaving, and the figures were gone. We quickly drove to the campgrounds. The entire way up, we constantly saw the figures standing in fields or by the side of the road, and even in the back of the cars that we passed. Once we pulled into the parking lot, we started running towards the cabin. He asked me how we were going to sacrifice the crow, and I told him that from all of my research, all we had to do was behead the crow with a knife. He said, okay, that didn't sound too complex. Anyway, we continued to run 3 miles to the cabin. We didn't see a single figure. We quickly reached the cabin and ran up to the pentagram. I slowly pulled the crow out from the towel. At this point, it was very much asleep from being wrapped in a towel. So I quickly pulled out and opened my knife, just to look up and see all 15 figures slowly circling us, watching me place the crow in the middle of the pentagram. They continued to watch as I sacrificed the crow. I quickly beheaded it, and then the figures slowly spelled out thank you on the Ouija board before completely dissolving into thin air, hopefully never to be seen again.